We've got a whole batch of new stories, and we've updated some of the language and things like that. And also the forward, if you read the book, the forward talks about the Kansas City Royals and their trip to the two World Series in a row. But since then, the Chiefs have gone to 2 Super Bowls in a row. So we updated the front to talk about the Chiefs and how they didn't have a Super Bowl for 50 years, and then they won one. So it kind of worked out great. And we also have a video series that goes with that book now, and, well, we will have, and a workbook or a study guide. And last I saw from Lifeway, that was supposed to be this fall, but now it's put off to this spring. But at some point, there'll be an update. But that book fills in the gaps. I did leave as director of missions in Kansas City. I went to go to Warnell to be their pastor. I resigned as the director of missions. I got a secular job, and I was bivocational for a number of years at Warnell Road until they grew large enough to be able to pay me something similar to a salary. Today, Warnell runs about 120, 150. So, and when I left, they were about 100. So the guy that's followed me has done a much better job, and he's a great young man. But the good thing about Warnell is, of that 150, half of them could walk to church if they had to. So it's a neighborhood community church, and I could talk more about that some other time. But I was at Warnell for 10 years, and we replanted 7 or 8 churches out of Warnell. And I wasn't ever planning on working for the denomination again. I was just going to pastor Warnell Road and replant churches, the rest of my life, or whatever. But Kevin Izell called me one day. I'd never met Kevin and didn't know who he was. And he called me one day, and he said, "Look, I've just been here at NAM a year, I think, and we've closed 900 churches a year, and somebody told me you replanted a church." And that started a discussion about a strategy to focus on dying churches, which eventually led to me coming to the North American Mission Board, leading a team for the first time. Well, first it was just me, and then over time we built a team. There's 10 of us now. Most of us are pastoring or doing something else, but one on our team is Howard Burkhart from California. Many of you know Howard. He's been around here, these parts, a long time, but he kind of covers the West for us, and so if you need anything in terms of replant strategy, anything that our team has to offer, Howard's a great resource, and he'd be grateful to serve you, and he already has in many ways. And so, that's what I do. And then, like I told you, then after I left Warnell, I did a transitional pastorate with 3 or 4 dying churches to help them move on to the next phase. And then God called me to where I am now at Linwood. Any questions on that? Anybody? Somebody felt like I didn't really fill in the gaps last night, so that maybe helps a little bit. We're going to talk this morning about 8 symptoms of a dying church. And hopefully we'll have enough time to talk about 4 cures for those symptoms. If I don't get to the cures, they're in the book, so you can read it there. But 8 symptoms of a dying church. There are more than that. I think there are 9 or 10 that we've identified. I'm just going to look at 8 of them this morning. If you go to the doctor and he looks at your blood work and he goes, "Look, this is not good," you say, "Well, I feel fine. I don't think it affects me." He goes, "No, it does affect you." And so these are symptoms. What we did, we didn't just pull these out of the air. We looked at the 800 dying churches a year. We did some in-depth study on those churches, on some of those churches, and discovered what were some of the commonalities that these churches had before they died. And we did this not too long before Rayner wrote his book, Autopsy of a Deceased Church. And certainly the research we did and the research he did coincide with each other. So here's what I'm saying. If you see any of these in your congregation, these are things you need to take care of. Because left unsolved, left unattended to, it's not going to end well. So see if any of these are in your congregation or in your church. First, and these aren't in any particular order of importance, but first, a failure to pass leadership to the next generation. I've never been in a dying church in my life. There may be one out there, but I've never been in a dying church in my life that says, "Here's the problem. We've got too many young men between the ages of 18 and 40. But I've been in a lot of dying churches where they've said, "We don't have any young people. We don't have any young leaders." And it's a failure to pass leadership. Why are they failing to pass leadership? Well, a lot of times what they'll say is, we don't have any young people. Can you help us find a young pastor? I get that question all the time. As if they just hire a young pastor, he's going to attract all kinds of young people and all their problems will be solved. It's like, well, if that was the case, I wouldn't have a job and we wouldn't need to write a book. I mean, just be we got young pastors, but that's not the problem. I've never had a church come to me and say, I haven't yet, look, we need to repent of why young people are not comfortable and don't feel like this is a place they can flourish. And if you just say, well, young people just don't come to church anymore, that's just absolutely not true. I can take you any place in your general community and probably take you to one church that's filled with young people. Young people just choose not to come to your church. And here's the deal. You have made decisions either intentionally or you have failed to make decisions you should have made that have made this place seem like a place where young people can't flourish. You may want young people to lead, but you're not really going to let them lead. You're going to criticize them. You're going to follow them around and tell them you shouldn't do it that way. We don't like it that way. That's not comfortable that way. That's not how we would do it. We're not going to change this. You can't do that. And look, if you don't let young people lead, young people will leave. Maybe not all at once. There may be a handful that stick around out of obligation. But if you give young people leadership and ownership, they'll stay. And it's a failure to pass leadership to the next generation. I went to a church in Kansas City one time. The church had been about 400 in attendance. It was down to about 200 very quickly. And it was in one of the fastest growing communities of the metro area. And yet the church was on a huge decline. And so I met with the pastor and the deacons in the fellowship hall down in the basement on a Saturday morning and said, we got problems here. We don't have many young people anymore. We're losing our young people. And I remember one of the deacons said, we're losing our young people to all of the church plants out here. I said, really? So like Sunday morning, black vans show up and just rip out your young people out of the parking lot and run them off to a church plant or what? They didn't laugh about that at all. They said, no, the church plants have all the money, all the energy, all the hype. They get all the attention. And so our young people are going over there. I said, all right. They had 10 or 12 deacons down there in the basement. And I was probably, mid-50s at that time. And I was the youngest person, I think, in the basement. So I said, anybody here younger than me? Nobody raised their hand. I said, all right, so where are your young deacons? To which the chairman of the deacons spoke up and said, well, that's just it. There aren't any young people here qualified to be deacons. And I said, well, that's just it. It's your job to raise them up and get them qualified. It's your job to do something to give on-ramps to leadership to young leaders and to develop them and to put them in place of leadership and to give them leaders. Look, it's like this, all right? When you get to be my age, you're like one flu season from heaven, okay? I mean, I'm not going to be around much longer. My life is a vapor. It's a gas. It's a wisp. It's gone. And my primary role at this age in my life is to make sure that that next generation has a strong base and on-ramp to do ministry, because I promise you this, as hard as it is for me right now to be faithful and to preach and proclaim the absolute truth of the gospel, it's going to be infinitely harder for my grandchildren to do that. And I need to give them every possible reason to succeed and not put any hindrances in front of them. And you need to create an environment where you literally give the keys to the car. Now look, if these young people love Jesus and know Jesus and follow Jesus and believe Jesus and are discipled and care deeply about the gospel and about the church, man, you need to come every Sunday morning and just weep and be grateful that they're actually in church. I mean, when you and I were in our 20s, we had this whole cultural bias that said good people go to church. You're going to be a school coach or a school counselor or a school teacher. You're going to sell used cars in your community. You're going to sell insurance in your community in the 1960s and 70s. You're going to join a church. If you didn't, people would think probably something kind of wrong with you. It's just opposite today. I mean, if young people choose to be part of a church, they're already going to be ostracized and considered to be bigots and threats. And So when you come to church and you see a young man or a young woman who's willing to stand for the gospel and stand for what's right, my goodness, you should give them, you should just weep and pray and be grateful that they're, rather than, I don't want to change some things, and I don't want to do that. A failure. You have to literally, listen, if they believe the gospel of Jesus, if they love his word, listen to me, please. You got to give them the keys to the car. You got to let them drive. You got to let them pick the music to listen to and how loud they're going to listen to it. And you got to sit in the back seat and you got to pretend like you're enjoying the ride. And if you pretend like you're enjoying the ride long enough, you know what's going to happen? You're going to end up enjoying the ride. When I showed up at Linwood, the little church, actually I think it was a beautiful little church building inside. Had little pews, and it just looked like a 1970s, 1960s century Southern Baptist church. Everything I remember as a kid. So in a world that's just so chaotic and unknown to me, I walked into that little church building. It's like, yeah, this is my home, man. I mean, I recognize the pews. I recognize the silk plants. I recognize the smell, the folding chairs. I got it. This is my place. These are my people. I mean, I can walk in the 1960s or 70s, mid-century little church building, and man, I'm right at home. Red padded pews, red carpet. I'm there. Well, we began to replant, and we began to reach a lot of young people, a number of them, who were from the area, and they looked at that and goes, this just isn't us. This just ain't us. They didn't grow up in the way I grew up. To them, this was like a foreign-looking, weird place. This wasn't like any place they hung out, and it wasn't a place they felt comfortable in. And so I said, all right, this is back when we basically had 4 or 5 members, including my wife and I. And I said, all right, you guys want to redo the sanctuary? Have at it. Do whatever you want to do. And they did, man. They got rid of the pews. If you go to Facebook and go to Linwood Baptist Church on Facebook, LINWOOD, LinwoodSBC.com is our website, LinwoodSBC.com. You'll see the picture. I mean, they painted everything black back here. The whole thing is black, right? And then they put it like, I don't know, they got some boards off of one of their guys' barns, and they put some barn wood, up and down like that and stuff like that. And we had these boxed beams, that were wooded out, but they took the boxed beams off, so it's just exposed metal right now, right? You got it? I mean, and you're looking at it, and I go, but okay, whatever. But they love it, and they own it. It's theirs. It reflects who they are. It's their heart, and that's great because it's their church. And I want them to own it. It's more than just the architecture, but it is the architecture. It is letting them have, and we sometimes we're so stinking protective of, well, you can't move that. You can't paint that wall. You can't paint over the baptistry. We can't move that Sunday school classroom. And then we wonder, why don't we have any young people here? You frustrate the dickens out of them. I was a transitional pastor of a church that was beginning to grow, and we needed to move our children all in one part of the building. The children were in several different parts of the building. And we had one new wing, and guess who had the new wing on Sunday morning and Wednesday morning and everything? It was the senior adults. And you know why? Because if you didn't believe you, they would tell you, which they did tell me as their interim pastor, you got to remember who pays the bills around here. Those are the very words I heard. I said, I do. His name is Jesus. And I had one lady say, you know what's going to happen if we quit giving our money? And I said, we'll probably keep growing better than we are because Jesus doesn't need your money. And of course, I'm an interim pastor, right? I can say that. And if you're giving it for any reason other than for the joy of giving it, then just keep it because it's not doing any good here. And don't be threatening me with, hey, we're going to withhold our money. But when the deacons allowed me and we were going to put the children in the newer building, I got all kinds of heat from some of these older Sunday. A number of them wouldn't come into worship. They'd go to Sunday school, then they would leave. As long as I was there, they weren't going to come into worship. And they had a meeting with me and basically sat across from me at a table and basically said, you don't know who pays the bills around here. You can't forget about us. All you care about is the young people. And I'm thinking, good land. Some of you have been Christians for 50 years. For 50 years, the mercy of Jesus has been new on your sorry head every single morning. You should have more grace coming out every part of your body than anybody in this church. Instead of that, you become bitter and contentious and you focus on yourself. And I'll tell you what, there is never joy when you focus on yourself. As Piper says, the purpose of the gospel is not to be made much of, but that I'm cleaned up so that I can make much of Jesus. And when we want to be made much of, that's a dead end. And look, you're not going to make people happy by making much of them. You're going to make people happy when they make much of Jesus and when they do what. So, let's give you a really good example of that. So when I went to Warnell, we had a couple of men, mostly elderly women, had a couple elderly men. One of them name was Forrest, and he was a former professor of engineering at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And Forrest had been at that church since the 1950s or 60s, a long time. And he always passed out bulletins, and all that. And he always sat on the front row. His wife was an invalid and couldn't ever come. But Forrest remembered the glory days of this church. And this church had some glory days. 700-800 people every Sunday. Beautiful choir. One of the best pipe organs in the city. They had a paid soloist. His name was Dean Wilder. And he was an amazing soloist. And he was paid to sing there every Sunday morning. He was a member, but he was a paid soloist. They had some great music, gorgeous music. And, back in the 50s and 60s and even in the 70s, man, it was a really beautiful church and a great church, but it declined. And so by the time I got there were, like I said, 18. And so Forrest remembered that. So when Forrest is thinking we're going to replant this church, he's obviously wanting to get back to all of that, right? Well, that's not going to happen again. So as it began to grow, we didn't make radical changes. You don't ever grow a church or transform a church. Music, that's not what happens, but we just didn't have the musicians, we didn't have the choir, so we just had somebody play guitar, maybe somebody play piano. And I know one Sunday we had a couple of guys come in, one played a box like that and one played a guitar, and we had some stools up here, and Forrest came up to me and he goes, "Preacher, this thing looks like a Branson country music show up there, Branson, Missouri, And he said, he just wasn't happy with that, and it was a hard struggle for him. And I'll talk about this, turn this around as far as loving the remaining members. But after a period of about 7 or 8 years, Forrest began to understand what we were doing, and God began to work in his heart. And there were a lot of Sunday mornings that Forrest's wife would call him on his cell phone while I was preaching, and he had his cell phone on speaker so he could hear her. So we all could hear her, actually. And she would say, like, "When are you coming home?" And he would say, "He's not done preaching yet." And that's while I would be preaching. If you've been preaching for a long time, those things don't bother you. You just keep going. And so we just kept going. It happened a few times. We had one family that joined our church, and whenever anybody would join, we'd ask, "Why in the world would you join this church?" That was sort of our question. We'd take them to pizza and say, "Tell me, why are you interested in joining?" And they said, well, one of the reasons was when that elderly gentleman's wife calls him on Sunday morning and sort of interrupts things, nobody looks at him, nobody seems offended by that, it doesn't seem to bother you. And she said, we want our children to grow up in a church where people loved and cared like that. So I eventually get a call from Forrest that his wife's passed away. And like I said, he's really grown through all of this. What we did on Saturday mornings, I met with all the young men, and I'll get to that in a minute maybe, but I met with the young men in our church every Saturday morning or every other Saturday morning, and we'd pray and do things like that. I had some churches in Kansas City said, we want to bring some of our lay people there, their leadership, and all of my young leaders, plus Forrest and this other older gentleman. And I said, let's just start with, instead of starting with the young guys, telling them what's going on at Warnell, let's start with these two older gentlemen who've been here for 40 years. Why don't you tell them what's going on at Warnell? So Forrest said, I'll begin. I said, okay. So Forrest goes, well, I didn't like anything when it started. he said everything we took away, everything we changed, everything he lost, everything wasn't like it was. He didn't like the music. He didn't like we didn't have Sunday school like we used to. He didn't like the way we let everybody use the building. He just went on and on. I'm going, this isn't going where I want it to go. And all this other church are going, yep, that's what we figured. It'd be just like that, Forrest his 80s, began to cry. And look, you have to be intentional about giving leadership, which means you have to sit back and let them lead, and not criticize them, and not look over their shoulder, and not take over the responsibility once you've given it to them. Number 2, they anesthetize the pain of death with an overabundance of activity and maintaining with great passion outdated governance and programs. They just keep doing what they're doing. They never evaluate anything. They say, we've been here, we're declining, we're struggling, we're hanging on. Well, what are you doing? Well, we're doing all of these things. Well, why are you doing these things? Well, because we've always done them in the past, because it's who we are. And all of this activity just sort of anesthetizes the pain of death. A lot of dying churches have Sunday morning, Sunday school, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. And their churches are dying. And then many of them even will have other programs. They do a bulletin every week. Some of them do a newsletter online or even through the mail. Some of them even have a part-time secretary. I mean, all of these things, there's nothing particularly wrong with that. But if your church is dying and you do all this activity and nothing is happening, many times all that activity just anesthetizes the pain of death. When I was doing a transitional pastorate not too long ago, we were meeting on Sunday nights because they'd always met on Sunday nights, and we never had more than 8 or 10 or maybe 12 at the most on Sunday night, maybe 40 or 50 on Sunday morning. And the 8 or 10, 12 on Sunday night were the same 8 or 10, 12 that had been coming on Sunday night since, the 1970s. And so it was in the fall, and, I showed up and I was preaching on Sunday nights. And when we were done, one of the older ladies said, I'd like to ask a question. I said, sure. And she said, it's getting dark earlier here. Many of us don't need to be driving in the dark. Maybe until the summer, we don't have Sunday night church. And before she even could finish saying that, one of the 2 deacons or 3 deacons stood up and said, well, you can stay home if you want to, but the rest of us are coming on Sunday night. And that idea is that we're not going to even examine the possibility as if what we're doing having any impact on the kingdom or on the community. We're just going to keep doing it, because as long as we keep doing it, we can't be dying. And yes, you can. And yes, you are. And sometimes all of that activity just anesthetizes that pain of death. So many times dying churches are busy churches. They still have committee meetings. They still have organizational meetings. They still meet 3 times a week. And sometimes you go to a church that's really making an impact on their neighborhood and their community and growing numerically, and they're so busy serving the community and being in the community, they don't come to church 4 and 5 times a week. Sorry if I've stepped on you there. Number 3, and this is like the death wheeze of a church. If you've been around a long time like I have, and you've been a pastor and you've been with people at the point of their death, you know how their voice and their breath changes right before they die. And so we call this the death wheeze of a church. When the church resents the community for not responding. You know how many times I hear that? Our community just doesn't respond to us. You don't understand what it's like. These people don't like us. These people aren't like us. These people don't want us here. These people are different. And what they're saying is there probably was a time in the life of that church when it was relatively homogeneous to the community. There was a time in the life of that church, probably in the previous decades, when, as I said, being a part of a church was considered a positive thing. You want to think about, look, I served in Canada, in Montreal, in the early 2000s, and that was in Quebec, and Quebec is the most unreached part of all of North America. I mean, Quebec turned its back on the Roman Catholic Church in the 1960s and 70s in a huge way with something called the Quiet Revolution, and the vast majority of people in Quebec are what they call themselves non-practicing Catholics, which is, I think, an interesting way to put it. That's what they call themselves. In other words, I'm culturally Catholic, but I don't believe in any of it, and I don't practice any of it. So when I was in Quebec, that whole idea of church as being something that we don't care for, we don't like, we don't trust was very evident. Now in Canada, many of you, you're close enough, you realize what's going on there with COVID and how shut down it is, but also with all of the news about what happened to the children, the native children, and how people are vandalizing churches and ready to be done with the churches and hating churches. Can I just tell you that maybe when my dad was a pastor in the 1950s and 60s, if you were going to be an evangelistic, Bible-believing church in most of North America, I'm from Kansas, and we have a pretty good basketball team at KU, and it'd be kind of like KU playing every game at Allen Fieldhouse at home. You still had to play the game, but everybody in the stands was rooting for you. Even when I was a kid, And my dad was the pastor of the Baptist church in the county seat town, and I'd go to school, and they'd say, "What's your dad do?" "Well, he's a pastor at the Baptist church." It was like, "Oh, that's good. That's a good guy. Yeah, your dad's a pastor. That's respected." Right? That was just in my lifetime. And I come along in the 80s and have a lot of my ministry, and it's a little bit like KU playing every game at a neutral setting, right? Kind of like, don't really care one way or the other. Today, it's like KU plays every game at Duke. Ain't nobody in the stands rooting for us. And we're not familiar with what it's like to serve in a hostile environment, but that's where we are. And if you resent the community for being the community that it is, that's the death squeeze of a church. Sam Rayner has said this, and it's so important. Your church's address is no accident. God has sovereignly brought these people to your neighborhood. I love what the brother said about the Great Commission. Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. Let me give you my interpretation of that that's really served me well for my lifetime. You ready? Jerusalem, that's obvious. Jesus says, take the gospel, and it is all at the same time. It's not sequential, it's all at the same time. Take the gospel here to Jerusalem. Jerusalem's where you live. That's obvious, right? Judea is the area just beyond Jerusalem, correct? And the uttermost part of the world, well, that's everywhere else. So why throw Samaria in there? Why didn't he say Jerusalem, where you live, Judea, the general region, and the rest of the world? Why would you say Samaria? Because the Samaria is the place across the street that you wish wasn't there. Samaria is the place that you believe the country would be better if it were gone. You realize that Jews wouldn't walk through Samaria. They would walk around it. They wouldn't touch anything a Samaritan had touched. They hated Samaritans. And Jesus is saying you don't get an option not to take the gospel to Samaria. Just because you don't like it, just because they don't like you, just because they hate you, just because they don't receive you, you don't get to go around them. And so when you begin to resent the community for not responding as it once did, that's the death wheeze of a church. It's basically saying there's something wrong with them and other than us, but yet if we're not reaching them, there's something wrong with us. And I just can't tell you how many times churches have come to me and said, you don't understand how difficult our neighborhood is. And this goes along quickly with it. They're no longer a fabric of the community. They're no longer part of the community. They're outside of the community. The church no longer has any impact whatsoever on the community. Listen carefully to me. Your goal is not to build a big honking church. It's never been my goal, ever. I couldn't do it anyway. And I want to tell you something. I think, truthfully, many of the guys who have large churches had nothing to do with it. Jesus just chose to do it through them. And if you put them in another place, they couldn't do it again. Not anything wrong with that. I'm just saying our focus on numerical size is really way out of whack. My focus needs to be on what is my church's ministry footprint here in this community. How does my church make the community noticeably better because we're here? Ask that question every single week. Rather than to focus on, well, we only had 20 this week, and maybe we'll get 25 next week, and maybe we can have 30 next year. Just ask yourself, how can we make this community noticeably better? You don't have a block party. Ultimately, this is just me talking here. You can disagree if you want to. I won't have a block party ultimately to get people to come to my church on Sunday morning. Because you can have a block party, and you can have a moonwalk, and you can have snow cones, and you can face paint. But guess what? If you got 500 people that come to your block party, you're probably not going to have anybody come on Sunday morning the next Sunday. You might, but not very many. Why? Because on Sunday morning, you don't have a moonwalk and face paint and snow cones. And they came for the moonwalk and face paint and the snow. Well, why do we do it? We don't have block parties to get people to come into our church building. Hold on. We have block parties to get the people in our church building out to the lives of the people in the community. That's why you have them. You don't give away food in order to get people to come to your church. You give away food because Jesus has given you everything. Those who've been dealt most generously wish to be the most generous people in the community. And we give away food because Christians love people more than anybody else in the world, and we don't want anyone to be hungry. And we are generous with our money, with our heart, with our resources, with our building, with everything, because Jesus has been so generous to us. And we're not resentful of the community. We love the community, and we become a part of the fabric of the community. We become important to the community. Sometimes the only resource you have is your building. How do you share it with the community? How do you let the community use it? How do you share your money with the community? How do you share your love and your time with the community? Like I said, you may have Sunday school, Sunday night, Wednesday night, different meetings throughout the week, but if you're not touching the lives of anybody in the community, the ground could open up, swallow your church, and the guy across the street would know no difference. That's not right. We are the church of Jesus Christ. We are to be salt and light. Our presence, if we are truly followers of Jesus, our presence in that community would make that community a sweeter, more wonderful place to live. And so many churches have long ago quit becoming part of the fabric of the community. Look, I don't want to give a bunch of stories, but when I went to Warnell, we didn't have anybody, and so I started going around the little businesses near the church and just introducing myself and hanging out and talking to people. And so I went into this one little cafe, and I was just going to say hey, and the guy was on the phone, and he was talking to the county assessor, and he was behind on his taxes, and they were about to shut him down, and he was having an argument on the phone. He slammed the phone down, and he said, what can I do for you? I said, well, I guess I'll have something to eat, if I'm going to buy something now. So we carried on a conversation. His name was John, and he was about to go out of business. And I said, look, I'm pastor of this big old church building across the street. I kind of know what you're going through. We're struggling too. But I said, look, if you'll let me take your menu, I'll photocopy it, and Sunday morning I'll give it to everybody at church, and I'll try to get all of our people to come over here and eat this week. And he said, well, how much are you going to charge me for that? I said, I'm not going to charge you anything for it. He said, well, I'm a member down here, and he named the Catholic parish, and he said, I'm a member down here, and he said, I asked our parish if they'd put something in the newsletter, and they wanted to charge me like $400. And I said, first of all, we don't have near the number of people that the parish has, but I'll sure do this. So I did. A lot of our few people we had did go eat at this place that week. So I called my director of missions. We didn't have any money at Warnell, and so I called my director of missions, and I said, look, I need about $150. I told him what it was for, and he gave it to us. So I went back over there, and when I said, look, here's what I want you to do, man, John, I want you to make about $150 worth of really good breakfast food, and next Sunday I want you and your wife to bring it over, and we're going to do a little church about 10 o'clock, sing some songs, and we're going to take a break, and I want our people to test your food and taste your food so they can get experience of it. He goes, that's just crazy. I go, well, maybe, but he said, I don't know if I feel comfortable about that. And I said, all right. So we waited a few weeks, and I kept talking, and finally he agreed to do it. And I said, just for the, he always had the apron and the hat. He was kind of a chef. And I said, I want you to wear your apron that Sunday. And he was culturally Catholic. He wasn't active, but he'd never been in a Baptist church, and he didn't know what in the world that would be about. But eventually he came, and so we put the food at the back and covered it up with some cloths, and we sang a little bit and had a little corporate worship. And I said, you know what, we got a couple of people here today. John and his wife over there, they own the cafe across the street, and we're going to try their food this morning. And so we just took a break, and people like Forrest thought I'd totally lost my mind. We took a break and started eating the food, and came back, and I just felt led to do this. And I said, man, I don't want to embarrass you, John, but you and your wife come up here, and a couple of our young leaders come up, and we prayed over them. We prayed for success in their ministry, or their business, I should say. And they began to weep and began to cry, and we had a great relationship with them, shared the gospel with them. They didn't respond to the gospel, shared the gospel with them, and they know Christians love them. And that got all over our community. And we did that numbers of times with different businesses trying to help them, and with the schools. The church needs to make the community noticeably better, because that's what Jesus would do, right? All right. How about this? Number 5. So this is what we've covered so far. They fail to pass leadership to the next generation. They anesthetize the pain with unnecessary activity. They resent the community for not responding, and they're no longer part of the fabric of the community. Number 5, that. I was talking to a church the other day, and this homeschool group wanted to use their building, and the community's growing. It's like, this is a great opportunity to let just use it one day a week. And do you know what the church said? They said, well, what if there's a funeral that day? Well, let's see if there's any other thing we can reason why we can come up with we don't want to share our building with anybody. It's a wonder God blesses some of us at all. We value the process of decision over the outcome of decision. 6thly, we value our preferences over the needs of the unreached. We say we don't, but we do. We just value what. There's so much change going on in the world, so much change going on in our life. For older adults especially, everything is changing. They don't even recognize their nation anymore. They don't recognize the culture anymore. Sears is gone. Kmart is gone. Bell Telephone is gone. They don't have to. It's all changing. Everything is changing. How you make a phone call? How do your cell system, your televisions? Do you do Hulu or do you do Amazon Fire or what? It all changes. It's all changing so quick. But they can still walk into church, and there's one place every week for a few hours a week. I understand this. I get this. This is what. Transaction on some of us. He has got us to believe that the comfort and the familiarity of the church and its surrounding and the way it's organized, that is what we actually crave. And that has become an idol, because sometimes an idol, among other things, is something you run to for meaning, comfort, and security. And people desire to have the building look the same, and the structure look the same, and the organization look the same, and the ministry look the same, the way we make decisions look the same, because that brings me comfort, meaning, and security. But something is a false idol if you're afraid of losing it. And so if you say, well, we might change the way we do so, you can't do that. We might move out the pews so we can have children say, you can't move the pews. I won't go there. I won't go there. I'll use my better judgment. But we value our own process. And here's the deal. It's when we realize that there is no joy in our own desires. My wife and I before I was pastor at Linwood, we went to a wonderful church in Kansas City that we love dearly, still do. And it has Saturday night service as well. So we could go on Saturday nights, and I could be out preaching somewhere else on Sunday morning. So Jill and I go on Saturday nights together. And oftentimes on Saturday nights, they would sing songs that I didn't know. And I love bluegrass. I love gospel. I love old stuff. I love three chords. I just love simplicity in everything. And so a lot of these songs I didn't know. And it's not particularly, I like a lot of ambient light in a church building. I like a lot of light. I don't like it dark. It's just personal privilege. That's just what it is. I'm just old. But, this Saturday nights, they'd have it all dark in there, and the front would be lit up, and they would see songs that I didn't particularly know. And to be frank about it, I should have sang, because the scripture commands us to, but sometimes I just say, I think I'll just kind of set this one out, because I don't know it, and I don't really feel like learning another song, so I just started being an old man, And but my wife is a little bit younger than me and listens to K-Love and stuff, and so she was trying to sing along with them, and she'd do a little better than I did. But this one Saturday night, there was a song that neither Jill or I knew at all, but across the aisle from us was this young mother who knew the song, obviously, and she raised her hands, and it was obviously very, very meaningful and moving in her life. And Jill remarked, just seeing you worship that way is the most beautiful thing I've seen tonight. And I want to tell you something. If you'll be a church that will value young people like that and let them know how much you love them and how joyful you are to see them love Jesus and how your preferences take second to what Jesus wants to do, you'll find joy in that church. Number 7, they make decisions based on keeping people rather than reaching people. When you begin to make decisions based on not losing folks, you've already lost, because then you've given up leadership. Well, we can't do that or these people are going to leave. We can't do that or this family will go away. We do that, she'll quit giving. Then you just let her be the pastor, right? I mean, if you're going to just absolutely give up leadership like that, then just go ahead and give it all over officially. You can't do that. You have to make your decisions based on what Jesus wants you to do. Henry Blackaby said, if that church dies, do you think they follow Jesus right into the grave? Or do you think they went another direction? And when you start going another direction so that you can please people and they don't get mad and they don't leave, then you've given up your leadership ability. And I see that in dying churches all the time. Well, we'd like to do that, but if we did, and here's the deal. There's so much conflict in the world today, so much conflict in our homes and our workplaces. We get to church and we go, you know what? We should probably open up the building and have this kind of ministry. And then somebody says, yeah, but I don't want to do it because of this. And yet maybe 90% of the people, or maybe almost everybody in the church would like to do it, but there's one family or one individual who's going to pitch a fit about it. And so a lot of people go, rather than to hear him pitch a fit for the next 5 years, we just won't do it. And they don't do it. And so we really have to understand that when you begin to make decisions based on pleasing the people you have and keeping the people you have, rather than reaching the people you don't have, you've got a problem. And number 8, an over-reliance on programs and personalities. We just need the right youth program. Whenever I go to a dying church, I say, we need young people. Well, what's that look like? Well, back in the day, we had a youth program. So if we could, you go to the seminary, could you find us a youth pastor? Could you pay for him, from the association office? Could you get us a youth pastor that could start a youth program? Listen, the last thing a dying church needs is a youth program. The dying church needs the 8 or 10 or 12 remaining members in that church to fall deeply in love with the unchristian, unchurched teenagers in their neighborhood and weep over them and love them and care for them. And when you come on Wednesday nights, if you still have prayer meeting on Wednesday night, spend a majority of your time praying for the teenagers in your neighborhood that don't know Jesus. But a program won't change your heart. A program will give you an opportunity to try to come in and pay somebody to do something. If it doesn't work, you can blame the program. Now, we need programs, but a program never changed anything. Again, all you think I do is talk about Henry Blackaby, but I had the privilege, when I went to Home Mission Board to work there, he came a few months after I did, and we lived in the same neighborhood, and he's been very influential in my life, and Richard and I travel around and speak together, so yeah, I do talk about Henry unapologetically a lot. But Henry used to say he'd go around to churches and they'd say, well, we tried this and it didn't work. And we tried that and it didn't work. And Henry, we tried this and this didn't work. And Henry, and the only way Henry could do it, would say, well, that's because nothing works. The only thing that works is Jesus. You can try everything, but none of it's going to work. Now, if Jesus tells you to do it, it'll work. But don't be trying this program and that program and that program. It won't work. There is no program that can change a church. There's no program that can change a heart. There's no program to change your heart. It's Jesus. Over-reliance on programs, and quickly an over-reliance on a pastor. We just call the right pastor. First of all, you can't afford the right pastor. And secondly, if you could, he wouldn't come to your place. So let's just get over that right now. Thirdly, and this is the most important part. Are you ready? You have a pastor. And his name is Jesus. And if you don't listen to him, you're not going to listen to the under-shepherd. All right? So it's not just that. All right, I'm going to give you the 4. I'm not going to be able to talk about them. I'm going to give you the four things to cure dying churches. Love the church's remaining members and get their hearts to warm to the gospel. Get them to love Jesus more than they love the church as they know it. And you do that by preaching the cross all the time, preaching the gospel all the time. Many of them have not heard enough gospel. They've heard moralism. They've heard Bible bingo week after week. That's just preaching from one text to another text. Get them into the gospel. Secondly, exegete and serve the community. I do a whole day on that, on how you can love the community. As you love the community will love you back. There are a lot of Mondays I wanted to leave the church, but I never wanted to leave the community. All right, I love the community. So